70 pounds of muscle teeth and combat trauma stood between the bleeding Navy SEAL and the doctors trying to save him. The Belgian Malinois wasn't just aggressive, he was grieving. While security reached for their heavy batons, a quiet triage nurse realized force would only end in a bloodbath. The emergency room at Mercy General did not smell like healing. It smelled like industrial bleach, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of old copper. Claire Bennett had worked triage long enough to know that Tuesday nights were usually reserved for bar brawls and minor car wrecks. She liked Tuesdays. They were predictable. You patched up a split lip, gave a lecture on seat belts, and drank terrible break room coffee until the sun came up. Then the radio on the charge desk crackled, breaking the low hum of the ward. Inbound medevac overflow, military transport, adult male, multiple GSWs, severe shrapnel wounds to the lower extremities, blood pressure 80/50 and dropping. ETA 2 minutes. Be advised. The dispatcher's voice hitched a rare break in professional protocol. Patient is accompanied by a military working dog. Animal is highly distressed. Proceed with extreme caution. Claire looked up from her charting. Dr. Peterson, a fourth-year attending, who treated every shift like a personal inconvenience, let out a loud, theatrical sigh. A dog, you've got to be kidding me. Tell them to call animal control. This is a sterile environment, not a kennel. They're 2 minutes out. Claire said flatly, tossing her pen onto the desk. Animal control is 30 minutes away on a good night. We're taking them. The double doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open. They were violently shoved apart. 2 paramedics practically ran through the entrance, pushing a blood-streaked gurney. But they weren't standing at the head and foot of the bed, as protocol dictated. They were flanked wide, their arms fully extended, desperately keeping their bodies as far from the center of the gurney as possible. The reason was immediately obvious. Straddling the unconscious patient was a Belgian Malinois. The dog was massive, its lean, muscular frame vibrating with a terrifying primal intensity. Its coat was a mix of fawn and black, but the right side was entirely plastered with dark, wet blood, the handler's blood. "Back up, back the hell up!" The lead paramedic shouted, steering the gurney toward Trauma Bay 1 with wide, panicked eyes. He nearly took a chunk out of my shoulder in the rig. We couldn't get a line in. We couldn't even get a pressure dressing on the thigh. Every time we reach, he lunges. Claire stepped out from behind the desk, her eyes scanning the scene. The patient, a man in his late 20s, pale as a sheet, wearing shredded tactical pants and a blood-soaked olive t-shirt, was dying. The monitor attached to him blinked a weak, erratic heart rate. The name taped to his battered chest rig read Thomas, but nobody was looking at Thomas. The entire ER staff had frozen their eyes locked on the dog. The Malinois stood over Thomas's chest like a gargoyle. His ears were pinned flat against his skull. The fur along his spine stood straight up, a jagged ridge of pure aggression. As Dr. Peterson instinctively took a step forward, the dog's lips curled back. He didn't bark. A bark is a warning. This was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to rattle the fluorescent lights overhead. It was a promise. "Jesus Christ!" Peterson muttered, freezing in his tracks. He threw a hand out, signaling the nurses behind him to stay back. "Get security down here right now. Get the police. I need this animal removed or this man is going to bleed to death on my floor." A nurse down the hall grabbed the wall phone, frantically dialing the security desk. Claire didn't move. She just watched the dog. She saw the terrifying jaws, the lethal muscle tone, the absolute readiness to kill. But she also saw the subtle tremors in his back legs. She saw the way his amber eyes darted frantically around the bright, loud room, completely overwhelmed by the chaotic stimuli. Most importantly, she saw what he was doing with his front left paw. It was pressed firmly against Thomas's uninjured shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive stance. It was an anchor. The dog was tethering himself to the only thing in the world that made sense to him. His handler was dying, and this dog was fighting a one-man war against a room full of strangers to protect him. "He's not rabid," Claire said quietly, though her voice didn't carry over the screech of the heart monitor. "He's terrified." The doors to the ER hissed open again, and 3 hospital security guards rushed in. They were big men, heavy in their boots, their hands instinctively resting on the pepper spray and batons strapped to their belts. The lead guard, Higgins, carried a long aluminum catch pole with a wire loop at the end. The moment the dog saw the pole, the situation deteriorated. The low growl erupted into a deafening, explosive bark. The Malinois snapped his jaws in the air, a terrifying clack of teeth that made one of the security guards visibly flinch and step backward. The dog shifted his weight, pivoting slightly so his body shielded Thomas's head, his dark eyes locked dead onto Higgins. "All right, clear the area!" Higgins barked, gripping the pole with 2 hands. "Someone get a sedative drawn up. A big one. If I can get the loop around his neck, I'll pin him to the wall and you dart him. If you miss, he's going to tear your throat out." Peterson said, his voice tight with panic. "Just call the cops. Have them shoot it. I'm not losing a patient and my medical license because we couldn't get past a mutt. Do not call the police," Claire said. Her voice cut through the noise this time. Sharp. Definite. She walked past the triage desk, ignoring Peterson's bewildered stare. She stopped about 10 feet from the gurney. The dog immediately tracked her, his focus snapping from Higgins to her. The deep, rumbling growl started again in his chest. "Claire, what the hell are you doing?" Peterson snapped. "Get back here. His blood pressure is tanking," Claire said, never taking her eyes off the dog. "You don't have time for a standoff, Dr. Peterson. You don't have time for animal control. And if Higgins tries to put that wire noose on a trained military dog, the dog will fight to the death. You'll have a dead seal and a dead dog in your trauma bay." "And what's your brilliant plan?" Peterson demanded. "I'm going to ask him to move." The ER fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the rapid, failing beeps of Thomas's heart monitor. The rhythm was growing faint. Hypovolemic shock was setting in. Higgins tightened his grip on the catchpole, stepping forward. "Look, lady, I don't care how many golden retrievers you've petted. This is a lethal weapon. Step out of the way." "Higgins, stop," Claire commanded. She didn't yell. She lowered her voice to a calm, authoritative timbre. It was the same voice she used on meth addicts screaming at the walls and panicking mothers in the waiting room. "You are holding a long stick to a combat dog that looks like a weapon. Every time you shift your weight, you're threatening his handler. Drop the pole." "Are you insane? Drop the pole, Higgins, or I'll write you up for endangering a patient by delaying critical care. Drop it." Higgins hesitated, looking to Peterson, who simply rubbed his temples in exasperated disbelief. Slowly, Higgins lowered the aluminum pole to the floor. It clattered against the linoleum. The Malinois flinched at the sound, letting out another sharp bark, but he didn't lunge. Claire exhaled slowly. "What's his name?" she asked the paramedics, who were still plastered against the far wall. "We don't know," the younger EMT stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "There was a tactical vest on the dog, but it got cut off in the field. The guy hasn't been conscious since we loaded him." Claire nodded. She looked at the dog. Really looked at him. She reached up and untied the plastic isolation gown she was wearing. It crinkled loudly, making the dog's ears twitch, but she stripped it off and tossed it aside. She kicked off her clunky hospital clogs, standing only in her socks. She wanted to be smaller, quieter. She wanted to remove the smell of sterile plastic and industrial sanitizer. "Claire," Peterson warned, his voice losing its arrogant edge, replaced by genuine fear. "Don't do this." Claire ignored him. She took one step forward. The dog's lip curled, baring wet white teeth. The growl vibrated through the floorboards. One more step, the dog's body language screamed, "And I will take your life." Claire stopped. She didn't back away, but she didn't advance. Instead, she broke the first rule of human instinct. She looked away. She turned her head slightly to the right, exposing the side of her neck. She let her shoulders slump, rolling her posture inward to make herself look entirely non-threatening. She kept her hands open, palms facing backward, relaxed at her sides. "I know," Claire murmured. Her voice was a low, steady drone, pitched just loud enough for the dog to hear. She didn't use the high-pitched sing-song voice people usually use with animals. She spoke to him like a grief-stricken adult. "I know it hurts. I know you're doing your job. You're a good boy. You're doing exactly what you were trained to do." The dog stopped barking. The growl remained, but his ears flicked up for a fraction of a second. Confusion. This human wasn't fighting back. This human wasn't acting like a predator. Claire took a slow breath, letting it out audibly. Dogs read breathing patterns. A held breath means tension and attack. A deep exhale means peace. She took another half step forward, dragging her socked foot across the floor, rather than lifting it, eliminating the sound of a footfall. The dog snapped at the air, his teeth clicking inches from her forearm. Gasps echoed behind her from the nurse's station. Claire didn't flinch. If she flinched, it meant she was afraid. If she was afraid, she was prey. "He's bleeding out, buddy." Claire kept talking, her voice a steady stream of calm water over the jagged rocks of the room. "You've guarded him all the way here. You did your job. Now you have to let me do mine. Or he's not going to wake up." The monitor behind Thomas let out a long, continuous tone. His blood pressure had just dipped into the danger zone. The alarms on the IV poles began to flash red. Time was completely out. Claire lowered herself into a deep squat, bringing her eye level below the dog's. She was entirely within his strike zone now. If he lunged, she wouldn't have time to raise her arms. He could crush her trachea in a single bite. She could smell the wet, metallic scent of the seal's blood on the dog's coat, mixed with the animal's musky sweat. She slowly raised her right hand. She didn't reach for the dog's head. That was a dominant gesture. She offered the back of her closed fist, keeping it low, right above Thomas's bleeding thigh. The Malinois lowered his massive head. The growl hitched in his throat. He sniffed her hand. His breath was hot against her knuckles. He smelled the latex of her gloves, the faint scent of her shampoo, the adrenaline practically radiating from her pores. But beneath it all, he smelled the total absence of malice. For 5 agonizing seconds, the room held its breath. The only sound was the frantic warning alarms of the medical machinery. Claire slowly unfurled her fingers, turning her hand over. She gently rested her palm flat against the tactical pants of the dying seal, right next to the dog's anchored paw. "Let me help him," she whispered. The Malinois looked at her. The wild, manic fire in his amber eyes seemed to flicker. He looked down at Thomas's pale face, then back to Claire's hand. Slowly, agonizingly, the rigid muscles in the dog's spine began to uncoil. The fur along his back laid flat. He let out a sound, not a growl, but a high-pitched, broken whine that sounded tragically human. He lifted his paw off Thomas's chest. Then the 70-pound weapon of war took one step backward, hopped awkwardly off the side of the gurney, and sat down on the cold linoleum floor, leaning his heavy head against Claire's knee. "Go!" Claire barked over her shoulder, the soft, quiet nurse instantly vanishing. "Push 2 units of Oneg on the rapid infuser, get a tourniquet high and tight on that right femur. Move." The spell was broken. The trauma team surged forward, flooding around the gurney. Peterson started barking medical orders, nurses grabbed IV lines and pressure dressings, and the chaotic symphony of emergency medicine roared to life. Amidst the screaming monitors and the shouting doctors, Claire stayed on the floor. She wrapped one arm securely around the thick, muscular neck of the Malinois, burying her face into his blood-matted fur. He leaned into her, completely trembling violently as he watched the doctors go to work on his handler. "You did good," she whispered to the dog, her own tears finally spilling hot against his coat. "You did so good." The crash doors of Trauma Bay 1 swung shut, swallowing the gurney, the shouting trauma team, and the bleeding Navy SEAL. The abrupt absence of chaos left a heavy, ringing silence in the emergency room. The Malinois lunged, His heavy claws scrambled frantically against the slick linoleum, searching for traction. A desperate, sharp bark ripped from his chest. He wanted to follow. He was bred to follow. Claire dropped her weight, wrapping both arms around his thick, muscular torso. Hey, hold on!" She grunted, digging her socked heels into the floor. The dog was pure kinetic energy. He dragged her 2 full feet across the slick tiles before stopping. He didn't turn his teeth on her. He just stood there, his rigid nose pressed mere inches from the seam of the swinging doors, whining a high, broken note that shattered the sterile air of the ward. "They're fixing him," Claire said, keeping her voice low and even. She kept one arm draped firmly over his shoulders. Her scrubs were now painted with Thomas's blood sticking uncomfortably to her skin. "You did your job. Let them do theirs." The dog didn't sit. He remained standing, his body locked in a state of hyper-vigilant rigor mortis. His amber eyes never blinked. Footsteps approached from behind. It was Higgins, the security guard, holding his radio. He kept a very generous distance. "Animal Control is still on the line," he muttered, eyeing the dog. "They want to know if they need to bring a tranquilizer gun." Claire slowly stood up, keeping her hand resting heavily on the back of the dog's neck. She could feel his pulse hammering against her palm. "Tell them to cancel the call. The dog is secure. Claire, you can't keep a military-working dog in the ER waiting room." Higgins argued, his voice laced with the exhausted irritation of a man who just wanted his shift to end. "Hospital policy, infection control. The night administrator will have my badge, and she'll definitely have yours. This dog is active duty military personnel." Claire lied smoothly. She had no idea how the Navy classified their K9S, but she knew how hospital administrators thought. They hated liability more than they loved rules. "If you hand him over to County Animal Control, you are impounding federal property. Do you want to explain to the Department of Defense why their $100,000 asset was put in a cage with strays? Because I will gladly give them your badge number when they come looking." Higgins stared at her. He looked at the massive, blood-soaked animal. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch cancel Animal Control. Situation contained." Claire exhaled. She looked down at the dog. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you out of the hallway." She didn't grab his collar. She just patted her leg and took a step toward the nurse's break room. The dog hesitated. He looked at the crash doors, then back at Claire. The bond was agonizing to watch. He knew his handler was behind those doors, but his handler had been unconscious, and this quiet woman was the only thing currently tethering him to reality. Slowly his head dropped. He followed her. The break room smelled of stale, burnt coffee and old microwaved plastic. Claire shut the door, clicking the lock. The room was tiny, holding only a round table, a sagging couch, and a small kitchenette. The Malinois immediately walked to the darkest corner of the room, wedged himself between the wall and the side of the refrigerator, and lay down. He didn't rest his head. He watched the door. Claire went to the sink. She found a plastic wash basin, filled it with warm water, and grabbed a stack of coarse brown paper towels. She pulled a chair over to the corner, sitting just outside his immediate space. "We've got a long wait," she said quietly. She reached out, wringing the warm water from the paper towel. She started with his right shoulder, the side that had been pressed against Thomas. The blood had already begun to dry, matting his thick fawn coat into stiff, dark spikes. The dog flinched when the wet towel touched him, his lip twitching upwards, but Claire didn't pull back. She just slowed her movements. She pressed the warm water into the fur, working the dried blood loose. Underneath the heavy leather collar, she found a heavy metal tag. She wiped away a smear of red to read the stamped letters. "Titan Uessen. Titan," she murmured. The dog's ears swiveled toward her. He recognized the name, but he offered no tail wag, no softening of his posture. He merely acknowledged that she knew who he was. For 2 hours, the only sounds in the break room were the hum of the old refrigerator and the rhythmic splash of water as Claire rinsed the towels. The basin turned a deep, rusty pink. She wiped down his flanks, his massive paws, and the side of his face. She wiped the war off him, but she couldn't wipe the trauma from his eyes. Titan was physically uninjured, but he was bleeding out on the inside. Every time a cart rattled past the break room door in the hallway, his muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. He was waiting for the ambush. He was waiting for the gunfire to start again. Claire tossed the last bloody towel into the trash. She slid off her chair and sat cross-legged on the cheap linoleum floor right next to him. She didn't try to pet him anymore. She just sat shoulder to shoulder with the animal, offering the only thing she had left, her presence. Eventually, the heavy, ragged breathing of the dog began to slow. The exhaustion of the fight finally caught up with him. Titan's head grew heavy. Slowly, he rested his massive chin heavily across Claire's knee. She leaned her head back against the refrigerator, staring at the fluorescent lights, and waited for the dawn. The knock on the door came just after 6 in the morning. Grey light was bleeding through the small, frosted window of the break room. Claire stood up, her joints popping in protest. Titan was already on his feet, his body rigid, his eyes locked dead on the doorknob. Dr. Peterson pushed the door open. He looked awful. His surgical scrubs were wrinkled, his surgical cap was sitting crooked on his head, and dark, heavy bags hung under his eyes. He held a chart in one hand and a half-empty cup of terrible hospital coffee in the other. He looked at Claire, then looked down at the dog. He didn't complain about the animal this time. He just sighed. 3 bullets. Peterson said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance, leaving only the hollow rasp of a man who had spent the entire night fighting death. One took a chunk out of his pelvis. One went clean through the calf. The last one severed the femoral artery. He had about 4 minutes left of blood in his body by the time you got that dog out of the way. Claire swallowed hard. Is he alive? Peterson took a slow sip of his coffee. Yeah, we patched the artery. Pumped him full of whole blood. He crashed twice on the table, but we got him back. He's in the ICU, intubated, sedated, and critical. But he's alive. Claire looked down at Titan. The dog was staring intently at Peterson, listening to the cadence of his voice. He didn't understand the English language, but he understood the shift in tone. The frantic, terrified energy of the ER was gone. I need to take him up there, Claire said. Peterson rubbed his eyes. Claire, the ICU charge nurse, is Brenda. She will physically fight you if you bring a dirty, unsterilized animal onto her floor. It's a sterile environment. He's clean, Claire said, gesturing to the dog's coat, which was now damp but free of blood. And he's not an animal. He's medical equipment. Thomas is going to wake up in a strange room surrounded by alarms, unable to speak, and pumped full of narcotics. If he wakes up and thinks he's still in a combat zone, he will rip his intubation tube out and bleed to death trying to fight his way out of the bed. You know this. You've seen it. Peterson stared at the wall for a long moment. He knew she was right. ICU delirium in combat veterans was violent, unpredictable, and often fatal. Take the back freight elevator, Peterson muttered, turning away. I didn't see anything. I wasn't here. Claire didn't waste time. Titan, heel. The dog stepped seamlessly to her left side, his shoulder brushing her thigh. They walked out of the break room, bypassing the busy main corridors. They moved like ghosts through the waking hospital. The intensive care unit was entirely different from the emergency room. There was no shouting. There was no chaos. Just the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of ventilators and the soft, glowing screens of monitors in darkened rooms. Claire walked past the central nurse's station. Brenda, the charge nurse, looked up from her computer. Her mouth opened to yell, her eyes widening at the sight of the massive dog. Claire just held up a hand and kept walking. Sometimes absolute audacity was the best camouflage. She found room 4. Thomas looked incredibly small. Stripped of his tactical gear, his uniform and his boots, he was just a young man lying in a bed. A thick plastic tube protruded from his mouth, taping his lips apart. Wires snaked from his chest to the monitors on the wall. Both of his legs were heavily wrapped in thick white gauze elevated on pillows. The heart monitor beeped a steady, if slightly elevated, rhythm. Titan stopped at the threshold of the door. He didn't rush the bed. He stood perfectly still, his nose working frantically. He smelled the bleach, the iodine, the heavy metallic scent of surgical blood. Then he heard the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator. "Go on," Claire whispered, releasing her invisible hold on the dog. Titan stepped into the room. He moved with impossible grace, his heavy paws making absolutely no sound on the floor. He navigated around the complex web of IV poles and catheter bags, understanding instinctively what not to touch. He reached the side of the bed. He stretched his long neck upwards, sniffing Thomas's pale, bruised face. He sniffed the plastic tube taped to his mouth. He sniffed the bandages on his legs. Then Titan let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of a spring uncoiling. The heavy protective armor he had worn since the ambulance bay seemed to melt off his frame. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. Titan raised his front paws and carefully placed them on the very edge of the mattress, avoiding the wires. He pulled his body up, sliding smoothly onto the bed. He didn't lay on Thomas. He curled his large body into a tight, compact ball in the small, empty space next to Thomas's uninjured left hip. Titan laid his heavy head across Thomas's left hand. Claire watched the monitor above the bed. Slowly, steadily, the numbers on the screen began to shift. The rapid, stressed heart rate of 115 beats per minute ticked down. 105, 98, 85, 72. The sharp, erratic spikes of the EKG smoothed out into a calm, steady wave. Thomas was heavily sedated, deep in a chemically induced sleep, but somewhere in the dark, chaotic void of his unconscious mind, he felt the familiar, heavy weight across his hand. He knew he was safe. The watch had been relieved. Titan closed his eyes. For the first time in 12 hours, the dog slept. Claire stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of the man and the dog, breathing in perfect unison. She quietly reached out, pulled the heavy wooden door shut, and walked back down the hall to finish her shift. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't won with force, but with a quiet understanding of someone else's pain. Claire didn't just save a soldier that night. She honored the unbreakable bond between a warrior and his fiercely loyal companion. If this incredible story of empathy and courage touched your heart, please hit that like button, share it with fellow dog lovers and supporters of our military. And don't forget to subscribe for more deeply moving stories every week.